There's a question most people never ask because the answer seems obvious. We assume certain qualities are universally good: humility, self-sacrifice, compassion for the suffering. These aren't just encouraged, they're celebrated as the highest expressions of human decency. But here's what's unsettling. What if the very virtues you've been taught to admire were specifically designed to keep you compliant? Not accidentally, not as a side effect, but as their primary function. Think about the moral education you received. You learned that pride is dangerous, that ambition corrupts, that putting yourself first is selfish. You learned to feel guilty about your desires, suspicious of your strengths, apologetic about your success. This wasn't random. This was systematic. And when you look closely at where these ideas originated, you find something that doesn't quite add up. Consider how Christian morality presents itself. It claims to offer salvation, liberation, eternal life. Yet its core teachings center on submission, denial, and the suppression of natural instincts. You're told your nature is fallen, your desires are corrupt, your strength is pride. The solution: make yourself smaller, want less, submit more. Call this humility, call it virtue. But here's the thing that should make you pause. Who benefits when you make yourself smaller? Throughout history, every system of control has needed a mechanism to make people regulate themselves. Physical force is expensive and unreliable. But if you can make people believe their own diminishment is moral excellence, you've created something far more powerful. You've turned the oppressed into their own jailers. The question isn't whether this happened with Christian morality. The question is how it was done so effectively that even now, over 2,000 years later, people defend their chains as if they were crowns. A 19th century philosopher noticed something others missed. He saw that the most celebrated virtues in Christian tradition weren't actually about making people better. They were about making people weaker, not physically weaker, psychologically weaker. And when he traced back to the origin of these values, he discovered they weren't born from strength, love, or divine revelation. They were born from something much more human: resentment, the resentment of those who lacked power toward those who possessed it. What followed was a moral revolution, disguised as spiritual enlightenment. A revolution that convinced the powerful to voluntarily surrender their strength and call it goodness. This isn't about attacking religion or defending atheism. This is about understanding how certain values function in practice versus how they're presented in theory. Because once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee it. And the implications reach far beyond religion, into every corner of how we judge ourselves and others today. Here's the anomaly that should immediately strike you as strange. Every virtue that Christianity elevates to sacred status shares one common feature. It requires the individual to diminish themselves. Humility means thinking less of your abilities. Meekness means accepting mistreatment without resistance. Compassion, as traditionally taught, means prioritizing others' suffering over your own flourishing. Self-sacrifice is literally in the name. Even faith demands you doubt your own reason in favor of external authority. Now compare this to how virtue was understood in pre-Christian philosophy. Ancient Greeks celebrated excellence, strength, beauty, courage, and achievement. Aristotle defined virtue as the highest expression of human potential, the full realization of your capacities. Romans admired honor, dignitas, and virtus, which literally meant strength and manliness. These weren't cultures without moral frameworks. They simply understood virtue as making yourself more capable, not less. Then Christianity emerged, and suddenly everything inverted. What the ancients called virtues became sins. Pride, taking pleasure in your achievements, became the deadliest sin. Ambition became suspect. Physical beauty became vanity. Strength became brutishness. And the qualities that ancient philosophers would have seen as weakness or failure were rebranded as the highest moral goods. The meek inherited the earth. The last became first. Blessed are the poor in spirit. This isn't just a different moral framework, it's a complete inversion of values. And here's what makes it anomalous. This inversion didn't happen because new philosophical arguments proved the old values wrong. It happened because a new religion, emerging from a subjugated people, needed a way to claim moral superiority over their oppressors. If you can't be stronger, richer, or more powerful, you redefine morality so that being weaker, poorer, and powerless becomes virtuous. Look at the historical context. Early Christianity spread among slaves, the poor, and the politically powerless in the Roman Empire. These weren't people who could compete on the terms of traditional virtue. They couldn't achieve excellence through strength, beauty, wealth, or political power. So they created a new moral vocabulary where their lack of power became evidence of moral superiority. The slave became morally superior to the master, not despite his chains, but because of them. This created a profound psychological mechanism. Instead of resenting their oppression, the oppressed could feel morally elevated by it. Suffering became redemptive, poverty became blessed, weakness became strength, and most brilliantly, this system convinced the powerful to adopt the same values. Imagine convincing Caesar that his power made him morally inferior, that his achievements were spiritual failures, that true virtue required him to think like a slave. What's unsettling isn't that this happened. What's unsettling is how completely it worked. Within a few centuries, the entire moral landscape of Western civilization had been rewritten, and to this day, people instinctively feel guilty about ambition, uncomfortable with pride, and suspicious of their own desires, without ever questioning where these feelings came from or who benefits from them. Friedrich Nietzsche didn't start as a critic of morality. He started as a classical philologist, someone who studied ancient languages and texts with extraordinary precision. Born in 1844 in a Lutheran pastor's family, he was surrounded by Christian morality from birth. His father and both grandfathers were Lutheran ministers. He was expected to continue this tradition. Instead, he became one of its most penetrating critics. But what made Nietzsche different wasn't that he rejected Christianity. Many intellectuals of his era did that. What made him different was that he understood exactly how Christian morality functioned psychologically. His training in philology meant he could read ancient Greek and Latin texts in their original languages. He could see precisely how ancient philosophers understood virtue and compare it directly to Christian reinterpretations. In 1869, at just 24 years old, Nietzsche became the youngest person ever appointed to the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel. He was studying how ancient texts shaped culture and values, and he noticed something that troubled him deeply. The more he read ancient philosophy, the more he realized that Christian morality wasn't an evolution or improvement of ancient ethics. It was an inversion, a deliberate rewriting of what virtue meant. This wasn't an abstract intellectual puzzle for Nietzsche. He lived it personally. He struggled with his health throughout his life. Chronic pain, digestive problems, severe migraines that left him bedridden for days. Traditional Christian morality would have told him this suffering was redemptive, that it made him more virtuous, that he should bear it with meek acceptance. But Nietzsche experienced firsthand how this framework drained life of vitality, how it turned suffering into an end rather than something to overcome. He began investigating where Christian values actually came from, not their theological justifications, but their psychological origins, and what he discovered was unsettling. He found that Christian morality wasn't born from strength, love, or spiritual insight. It was born from what he called ressentiment, a deep psychological resentment that the powerless felt toward the powerful. Unable to compete on terms of strength, the weak created a new moral framework where their weakness became virtue and the strength of their oppressors became vice. Nietzsche traced this back to what he called the slave revolt in morality. Before Christianity, he argued, morality was defined by the powerful, those who could act, create, and shape their world. They called themselves and their qualities good, but then the powerless rebelled, not through force, but through a moral inversion. They declared that everything the powerful valued was actually evil, and everything that characterized their own powerlessness was actually good. Meekness, humility, self-denial. These became virtues precisely because they were what the powerless possessed by default. This wasn't just historical analysis. Nietzsche saw these values still shaping his own culture in 19th century Europe. People were still judging themselves by standards designed to suppress vitality, creativity, and individual excellence. They were still feeling guilty about their strengths and proud of their weaknesses, and nobody was questioning where these standards came from or whether they actually served human flourishing. The first piece of evidence Nietzsche presents is disarmingly simple. Look at the language itself. In ancient aristocratic morality, good originally meant noble, powerful, beautiful, and happy. The Latin bonus connected to wealth and warrior prowess. The Greek agathos meant excellent, brave, capable. Being good meant being capable of greatness. The word bad simply meant common, plebeian, low. not evil, just ordinary. Then examine how Christianity redefines these terms. Good becomes associated with poverty of spirit, meekness, humility, and suffering. Bad becomes evil, a much stronger term laden with moral condemnation. And evil is associated with precisely the qualities ancient morality celebrated: pride, strength, self-assertion, joy in one's own power. This isn't a subtle shift. It's a complete linguistic and moral inversion. Nietzsche found this pattern repeated across Christian texts. Take the Beatitudes, perhaps Christianity's most celebrated moral teaching. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Notice what's being blessed: conditions of powerlessness, suffering, and weakness. This isn't accidental phrasing, it's systematic revaluation. But here's what makes this evidence particularly striking. These aren't presented as strategies for coping with difficult circumstances. They're presented as absolute moral truths. You're not told that if you're poor, you can find dignity in your situation. You're told that poverty of spirit is inherently superior to spiritual richness. That meekness is inherently superior to strength. That persecution indicates moral superiority over those doing the persecuting. Nietzsche traced this pattern through Paul's letters, where it becomes even more explicit. Paul repeatedly celebrates weakness and condemns strength. When I am weak, then I am strong. God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. This isn't paradoxical wisdom. It's a direct assault on aristocratic values. It's saying that traditional markers of excellence, wisdom, strength, capability, are actually inferior to their opposites. The evidence becomes stronger when you examine which human impulses Christianity targets most aggressively. It's not murder or theft. Those are condemned in most moral systems. Christianity's unique emphasis falls on pride, ambition, self-assertion, sexual desire, and joy in one's own abilities. These are precisely the impulses that drive individuals to excel, to distinguish themselves, to rise above mediocrity, and they're categorized not just as errors, but as sins, moral transgressions that damn your eternal soul. Consider the 7 deadly sins. Pride tops the list. Envy, greed, and lust follow, all impulses related to wanting, desiring, and striving. Meanwhile, the 7 virtues emphasize submission and restraint, humility, charity, chastity, patience. You're being taught that the impulses that drive achievement are evil, while the postures of submission are divine. This isn't random. This is strategic moral engineering. What makes this evidence compelling isn't that Christian morality differs from other systems. It's that it specifically inverts the values of those in power and elevates the conditions of the powerless to moral ideals. If this were truly about universal human flourishing, you'd expect a more balanced approach. Instead, you find a systematic attack on exactly the qualities that enable individuals to thrive, create, and excel, and a corresponding elevation of the qualities that characterize submission and limitation. Nietzsche digs deeper by examining the psychological mechanism behind this moral inversion. He identifies what he calls ressentiment, not just resentment, but a specific psychological condition where the powerless harbor deep hostility toward the powerful but can't express it directly. So they express it indirectly through moral condemnation. They can't say, I hate that you're stronger than me, so they say, your strength is morally corrupt. This mechanism is visible throughout Christian tradition. The rich man can barely enter heaven. The powerful will be humbled. The first will be last. These aren't just observations about fate. They're expressions of resentment dressed up as cosmic justice. Those who can't achieve wealth, power, or excellence in this life are promised that these very failures will be rewarded in the next. Meanwhile, those who succeed are threatened with eternal punishment for their success. What makes this psychologically sophisticated is that it protects the weak from having to confront their own powerlessness. Instead of saying, I am weak and wish I was strong, they say, I am morally superior because I am weak, and the strong are evil. This transforms a condition of deficiency into a badge of superiority. The slave doesn't need to break his chains. He can declare his chains make him more virtuous than the master. Nietzsche traced this pattern to what he called slave morality versus master morality. Master morality is created by the powerful to describe themselves. It's affirmative, life-celebrating, and judges actions by their consequences. Slave morality is created by the powerless as a reaction against their oppressors. It's negative, life-denying,
and judges actions by intentions and adherence to rules.
Master morality says, this is good because it increases life, power, and excellence. Slave morality says, this is good because it follows the rules and doesn't threaten the weak. You can see this distinction in how each morality treats fundamental concepts. Master morality celebrates health, beauty, strength, and joy as self-evidently valuable. Slave morality is suspicious of these things, treating them as potential sources of pride and therefore sin. Master morality values authenticity and self-expression. Slave morality values conformity and self-denial. Master morality asks, does this increase life? Slave morality asks, does this follow the commandments? The investigation reveals something even more unsettling when you examine Christian teachings on specific virtues. Take compassion, which Christianity elevates to unprecedented importance. Sounds admirable, right? But Nietzsche asks, what does compassion actually do psychologically? It ties your well-being to the suffering of others. It makes you emotionally dependent on identifying and responding to pain. It turns suffering into something valuable, something that demands attention and response. This creates a perverse incentive structure. If compassion is the highest virtue, then suffering becomes necessary for others to be virtuous. The sufferer becomes morally important precisely because of their suffering. This doesn't eliminate suffering, it valorizes it. It makes suffering meaningful in a way that discourages people from overcoming their condition, because doing so would deprive others of opportunities for compassion. Nietzsche wasn't saying compassion is always bad. He was saying that when it's elevated to the supreme virtue, it creates a psychology that's attracted to suffering rather than health, to weakness rather than strength, to problems rather than solutions. Christian morality doesn't just respond to suffering, it needs suffering to function. Without the weak, the poor, the sick, and the oppressed, there would be no opportunity for the virtues Christianity celebrates. The deeper you investigate, the more you see how the entire system functions to suppress vitality and life affirmation. Every natural impulse toward growth, excellence, and self-assertion is reframed as sin. Every acceptance of limitation is reframed as virtue. The message is clear. Your nature is corrupt, your desires are dangerous, your strength is pride. The only path to goodness is to make yourself smaller, weaker, more compliant. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore once you see it clearly. Christian morality systematically targets and condemns exactly the qualities that enable individual flourishing, while celebrating qualities that maintain social control and psychological submission. This isn't coincidental. It's the core function of the system. Start with humility, perhaps Christianity's most celebrated virtue. Humility means thinking less of your abilities and achievements. But what does this actually accomplish? It makes you less likely to assert yourself, less likely to challenge authority, less likely to believe you're capable of greatness. A humble person doesn't threaten existing power structures because they don't believe they're worthy of power. They've internalized their own subordination and called it virtue. Now consider pride, Christianity's greatest sin. Pride means taking pleasure in your achievements, recognizing your worth, believing you're capable of excellence. These are precisely the psychological foundations of ambition and self-actualization. By categorizing pride as sinful, Christian morality attacks the very mindset necessary for individuals to distinguish themselves. You can't pursue excellence if you've been taught that believing you're capable of excellence is evil. The pattern extends to how Christian morality handles strength and power. Physical strength becomes brutishness. Political power becomes corruption. Intellectual confidence becomes arrogance. Meanwhile, weakness is reframed as gentleness, political powerlessness as moral purity, and intellectual doubt as faithful humility. Every form of capability is treated with suspicion, while every form of limitation is valorized. Look at how this pattern plays out with desire and pleasure. Sexual desire becomes lust, ambition becomes greed, enjoyment of physical pleasures becomes gluttony or sloth. The message is consistent. Your desires are corrupt, your pleasures are dangerous, your natural inclinations lead to sin. The only safe path is denial, restraint, and suspicion of your own nature. This creates individuals who police themselves more effectively than any external authority could. What reveals the pattern most clearly is examining what Christian morality doesn't condemn. It doesn't condemn obedience, even mindless obedience to unjust authority. It doesn't condemn self-suppression or the denial of your own needs. It doesn't condemn remaining in conditions of powerlessness or accepting mistreatment without resistance. These things aren't sins. They're often presented as virtues. The pattern is clear. Anything that makes you less of a threat to existing power structures is good. Anything that might make you more autonomous, capable, or self-directed is suspect. Nietzsche saw this pattern replicated in how Christian tradition treats knowledge and inquiry. Faith means believing without evidence, accepting authority over your own reason. Questioning is doubt, which is sin. The pursuit of forbidden knowledge echoes the original sin in Eden. You're taught to distrust your own capacity for understanding and to submit to external authority, whether scripture, priests, or tradition. This isn't about protecting divine truth. It's about preventing individuals from thinking independently. The pattern becomes even clearer when you examine Christian martyrology and the celebration of suffering. Saints are those who suffered most, often those who sought suffering deliberately through self-flagellation, extreme fasting, and other forms of self-harm. This isn't incidental. It's central to the moral framework. The more you damage yourself, the more virtuous you are. The more you suppress your nature, the holier you become. The message is unmistakable. Your flourishing is suspicious, but your suffering is sacred. What emerges isn't a morality designed to help humans thrive. It's a morality designed to make humans controllable. Every impulse toward autonomy, excellence, or self-assertion is reframed as sin. Every acceptance of limitation, submission to authority, or denial of self is reframed as virtue. And most brilliantly, this system convinced people to internalize these values so completely that they enforce them on themselves without external coercion. The implications of this pattern extend far beyond religious belief. Even in secular modern societies, these Christian moral frameworks continue shaping how people judge themselves and others. You don't need to be Christian to feel guilty about ambition, uncomfortable with pride, or suspicious of your own desires. These attitudes have been so deeply embedded in Western culture that they feel like natural human psychology rather than historically contingent values. Consider how this plays out in contemporary life. When someone achieves success, we expect them to be humble about it, to downplay their abilities and attribute their achievements to luck or help from others. Someone who openly celebrates their excellence is considered arrogant. We've retained the Christian suspicion of pride, even while abandoning the theology. The successful person is supposed to apologize for succeeding, to feel guilty about having more than others, to constantly signal their awareness that they don't deserve their position. This creates a psychological burden that limits human potential. If you've been taught that believing in your abilities is arrogant, that wanting success is greedy, that enjoying your achievements is prideful, you'll unconsciously sabotage yourself. You'll pull back just as you're about to excel. You'll feel guilty about your victories. You'll apologize for your strengths. Christian morality doesn't just condemn excellence. It makes people unable to pursue excellence without psychological conflict. The implications become more troubling when you examine how this morality affects relationships and social dynamics. Christian teaching emphasizes that you should love others as yourself, turn the other cheek, and forgive without limit. Sounds noble until you realize what it means in practice. You're not allowed to establish boundaries, defend yourself against mistreatment, or prioritize your own well-being. Someone who refuses to tolerate abuse is considered unforgiving and un-Christian. Someone who protects their own interests is considered selfish. This creates ideal conditions for exploitation. If you've internalized the belief that self-sacrifice is the highest virtue, you'll allow others to use you and feel guilty for resenting it. You'll give beyond your capacity and call it love. You'll accept mistreatment and call it forgiveness. You'll suppress your legitimate needs and call it virtue. Meanwhile, those willing to exploit your self-sacrificing nature benefit enormously while you deteriorate and call your deterioration spiritual growth. Nietzsche saw how this morality affects entire societies. When a culture celebrates weakness, it doesn't eliminate weakness, it multiplies it. When suffering is valorized, people become attached to their suffering rather than working to overcome it. When humility is sacred and pride is sinful, people actively avoid excellence and achievement. The result isn't a more moral society, it's a society of individuals who've been taught to suppress their potential and feel virtuous about their suppression. The implications extend to how we understand mental health and well-being. Christian morality teaches that your nature is corrupt, your desires are dangerous, and you should distrust yourself. This is exactly the mindset that generates anxiety, depression, and self-loathing. You're taught to wage war against your own impulses, to feel guilty about natural desires, to see yourself as fundamentally flawed. Then when this creates psychological suffering, Christianity offers itself as the cure: more submission, more self-denial, more acceptance of your fallen nature. What makes this particularly insidious is how it frames resistance as further evidence of your corruption. If you question whether constant self-denial is healthy, that's your pride speaking. If you resist teachings that make you feel worthless, that's your arrogance. If you want to pursue your own flourishing rather than constant self-sacrifice, that's your selfishness. The system is self-reinforcing. Any attempt to escape is reframed as proof that you need it more. The deepest implication is that Christian morality doesn't just fail to promote human flourishing, it's designed to prevent it, not accidentally but essentially. Because if humans were to fully embrace their potential, pursue excellence without guilt, assert themselves without shame, and celebrate their achievements without apology, they would be much harder to control. They would question authority rather than submitting to it. They would trust their own judgment rather than deferring to tradition. They would create their own values rather than accepting imposed ones. Now we arrive at what Nietzsche calls the most sophisticated conspiracy in human history, though conspiracy isn't quite the right word, because it wasn't planned by any individual or group. It was a psychological mechanism that spread organically because it served multiple functions simultaneously. Christian morality gave the powerless a way to feel superior to the powerful, gave authorities a way to control populations without force, and gave individuals a way to avoid confronting their own limitations. Think about how brilliantly this system functions. For the oppressed, it provides psychological relief. You don't need to risk rebellion or face your powerlessness. Instead, you can believe. Your suffering makes you morally superior. Your poverty is blessed. Your weakness is strength. Your subjugation is evidence of your virtue. This doesn't eliminate oppression, but it makes oppression psychologically bearable by reframing it as spiritual advantage. For authorities, whether religious, political, or social, this morality is perfect for maintaining control. You don't need armies or police to keep people in line if they've internalized values that make them police themselves. Teach people that obedience is virtue, that questioning authority is pride, that accepting their station is humility. They'll not only accept their subordination, they'll actively resist anyone who tries to change it, because changing it would mean losing their moral superiority. For individuals, this morality provides escape from the burden of excellence. Pursuing greatness is difficult, uncertain, and requires risking failure. Much easier to declare that pursuing greatness is actually sinful pride, that true virtue lies in remaining small, that accepting limitation is actually spiritual wisdom. This transforms what would be a painful admission of defeat into a proud declaration of moral superiority. The conspiracy, if we can call it that, is that these three functions reinforced each other. The oppressed spread these values because it gave them psychological comfort. Authorities encouraged these values because it made populations controllable. Individuals adopted these values because it provided relief from the anxiety of self-actualization. And Christianity provided the perfect vehicle for spreading this moral framework because it connected these psychological mechanisms to cosmic truth and eternal consequences. What makes this particularly powerful is how it spread. Christianity didn't conquer through military force, at least not initially. It spread through psychological appeal. It offered the powerless a framework where their powerlessness was actually power, where their suffering was actually redemption, where their failures were actually success. This was tremendously attractive to anyone who felt defeated by life. And once someone adopted this framework, they had a powerful incentive to spread it, because doing so validated their own choice. The historical record shows this clearly. Christianity spread fastest among slaves, the poor, women, and others, excluded from traditional power structures in the Roman Empire. These weren't people who could achieve excellence through conventional means. Christianity offered them an alternative. Declare that conventional means are actually morally corrupt, that their inability to access power is actually moral purity, that their exclusion is actually blessing. Then something remarkable happened. Christianity convinced the powerful to adopt these values too. Imagine pulling off this psychological feat, convincing emperors and nobles that their power made them morally inferior to slaves, that their achievements were spiritual failures, that true virtue required thinking like the powerless. This shouldn't have worked. Yet within a few centuries, the entire aristocratic class of Europe had adopted a moral framework created by and for the powerless. How did this happen? Partly through political conversion of authorities, but more fundamentally through psychological manipulation. Christianity taught that no amount of worldly success could guarantee salvation. You could be the most powerful person on earth and still be damned. Meanwhile, the poorest slave could achieve eternal life. This created anxiety that undermined any sense of security in worldly achievement. The only relief from this anxiety was to adopt Christian values, to demonstrate your humility, your charity, your acceptance that worldly power meant nothing. The result was a moral framework that served everyone except those who actually wanted to pursue excellence and flourishing. It comforted the powerless without requiring them to become powerful. It controlled the masses without requiring authorities to use force. It relieved individuals of the burden of self-actualization while making them feel virtuous about their retreat. And it spread across civilization not through truth, but through psychological utility. It didn't need to be true. It needed to be useful for managing the human condition. The question now becomes, if Christian morality functions as Nietzsche describes, why hasn't this been obvious to everyone? Why did it take over 2,000 years for someone to clearly articulate this pattern? The answer reveals another layer of the system's sophistication. It contains mechanisms that prevent people from seeing how it functions. First, Christian morality presents itself as universal truth rather than historical construction. It claims to come from God, which means questioning it isn't just disagreeing with a philosophical system, it's rebelling against divine authority. This elevates the cost of criticism enormously. You can't just say, I think this moral framework is wrong, when it's been framed as God's eternal commandment. Questioning becomes not just intellectual error, but spiritual rebellion deserving eternal punishment. Second, the system teaches that doubt itself is sinful. Faith means believing without evidence, accepting what you're told despite your own reasoning. If you start questioning whether Christian values actually promote flourishing, that doubt is reframed as lack of faith, which is itself a moral failure. The system makes you guilty for noticing its problems. Your critical thinking becomes evidence of your corruption, rather than legitimate inquiry. Third, Christian morality creates language that obscures its function. It doesn't say, make yourself weaker and more controllable. It says, pursue holiness, virtue, and salvation. It doesn't say, suppress your potential. It says, overcome your sinful nature. It doesn't say, accept oppression. It says, blessed are the meek. The framing makes the function invisible. People pursuing humility don't realize they're actively working to limit themselves. They think they're pursuing moral excellence. Fourth, the system benefits from survivorship bias. Those who fully internalize Christian values and successfully suppress their potential don't become visible critics. They become devout believers. They're living proof that the system works. If you define working as making people accept their own limitation, the only people who might notice the problem are those who resist the values, but they've been categorized as sinful, prideful, and evil. Their criticism is dismissed as evidence of their moral failure. Fifth, Christian morality was spread and enforced by the most powerful institutional structure in Western history, the Catholic Church, followed by various Protestant churches. These institutions controlled education, shaped law, and defined what could be said publicly about morality for over 1,000 years. Criticism wasn't just philosophically difficult, it was physically dangerous. People were executed for heresy. Books were banned and burned. Alternative moral frameworks were systematically suppressed. Sixth, even when people began questioning Christianity's theological claims during the Enlightenment, they often retained its moral framework. They rejected God, but kept Christian values, simply giving them secular justifications. They stopped believing in sin and salvation, but continued believing that humility is good and pride is bad, that self-sacrifice is noble and self-interest is corrupt. The moral framework survived the death of the theology that justified it, which meant its function remained invisible even to those who considered themselves free from Christian influence. Seventh, Christian morality feels true because it addresses real human experiences. Humility does prevent certain forms of self-deception. Compassion does create social bonds. Self-sacrifice sometimes is necessary. The system works with genuine insights about human psychology, which makes it harder to see that these insights are being weaponized against flourishing rather than promoting it. You can acknowledge that humility has value while still recognizing that elevating it to supreme virtue serves a controlling function. Finally, perhaps most importantly, seeing this pattern requires you to question values that feel fundamental to your identity. If you've built your life around Christian morality, recognizing its function means confronting that you've been limiting yourself unnecessarily, that you've felt guilty about your strengths for no good reason, that you've suppressed your potential in service of values designed to keep you controllable. This realization is painful enough that most people unconsciously avoid it. Nietzsche could see this pattern partly because he had the classical education to compare Christian values against pre-Christian alternatives. He could read Aristotle and see that excellence used to mean something completely different. He could read Thucydides and see that strength used to be celebrated. He had a reference point outside the Christian moral framework, which most people living within that framework lack. They think Christian morality is just morality, because they've never deeply engaged with alternatives. Here's the final revelation that brings everything together. Christian morality isn't wrong because it's religious. It's not problematic because it contradicts science or makes supernatural claims. It's problematic because it systematically works against human flourishing while presenting itself as the path to flourishing. It makes people weaker while telling them weakness is strength. It suppresses potential while calling suppression virtue. And it does this so effectively that even people who've abandoned Christianity often retain its moral framework without questioning it. The question isn't whether humility or compassion can ever be valuable. Of course they can. The question is whether these should be your highest values, whether they should override your own flourishing, whether you should pursue them even when doing so requires suppressing your potential. And the answer, if you're honest about what promotes actual human thriving, is no. These can be tools you use when appropriate, but they shouldn't be chains you wear permanently. Nietzsche's alternative isn't nihilism or selfishness. It's what he called affirmative virtues, values that celebrate life, strength, creativity, and individual excellence. Instead of humility that diminishes you, cultivate honest self-assessment that recognizes both strengths and limitations. Instead of self-sacrifice that depletes you, practice generosity that flows from abundance. Instead of meekness that accepts mistreatment, develop strength that commands respect. Instead of faith that demands you doubt your reason, trust your capacity for understanding while remaining open to being wrong. This means recognizing that not all virtue is liberating. Some virtues, as traditionally taught, are chains disguised as goodness. They were designed not to elevate humanity, but to manage it, not to promote flourishing, but to prevent the chaos that authorities feared would result from individuals pursuing their full potential. The path forward isn't rejecting all morality, it's consciously creating values that actually serve human excellence rather than suppress it. So here's what you need to understand. Every time you feel guilty about your ambition, question where that guilt comes from. Every time you apologize for your success, ask who benefits from your apology. Every time you suppress your desires in the name of virtue, examine whether that virtue actually makes you better or just makes you smaller. The values you've inherited aren't neutral. They have a history, a function, and often a purpose that conflicts with your flourishing. This isn't permission to be cruel or selfish. It's recognition that true virtue should make you more capable, not less. It should expand your life, not contract it. It should be chosen consciously based on what actually promotes excellence, not inherited unconsciously from a moral framework designed for different purposes. You can respect others without diminishing yourself. You can be generous without self-sacrifice. You can be strong without being brutal. But first, you need to see the chains for what they are. The final question isn't whether Christian morality is divinely inspired or historically constructed. It's whether the values you live by actually serve your flourishing or systematically work against it. And once you honestly examine that question, you can't go back to unconsciously accepting inherited values. You become responsible for consciously choosing what you value and why. That's harder than following traditional morality. It's also the only path to genuine freedom and excellence. What will you choose?